Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. We now see the picture that has really shocked many in the recent days. These are the graves not so far from Kiev, near the city of Irpin, that unfortunately have become home to numerous Ukrainian civilians who have been tortured to death or died some other form of very torturous death because of being under the occupation of the Russian forces. Today, we will look into the progress Ukraine and the international community have made in terms of documenting, investigating, and prosecuting the atrocities that resulted from Russia's aggression. My name is Katerina Busol. I'm a Ukrainian international lawyer and an academic associate at Chatham House, and I welcome you today, as well as three our amazing professional speakers who have so much of the hands-on experience on Ukraine. Please let me welcome Ms. Zera Kozleva, who is the deputy head of Ukraine's War Crimes Unit and has been involved in designing the investigations and prosecutions of atrocities resulting of Russia's aggression, not only since February this year, but indeed since 2014. Then we are happy to have Mr. Wayne Jordash, who is a Queen's Counsel and a managing partner at Global Rights Compliance. And indeed, Wayne's law firm is the only one that has the sustainable experience of working with the Ukrainian civil society and with the Ukrainian government since 2014 on the very large scope of war-related violations, as well as advising them, both the government and the civil society, on documenting such violations and submitting the evidence to the International Criminal Court. Finally, we are very lucky to have Mr. Elliot Higgins, who is the founder and creative director of Bellingcat, the investigative initiative that has really changed the attitude to the open source evidence and to the use of that evidence in international and domestic proceedings. We of course know about their work in relation to Syria, to the MH17, and we will be very interested in hearing about how their work on Ukraine has changed with a new wave of Russia's invasion in February this year. Dear colleagues, this webinar is the continuation of Chatham House's discussions concerning the international legal dimensions of Russia's invasion, and you might be interested in revisiting two other discussions we have already had on the special tribunal for the crime of aggression and on other avenues to investigate and prosecute the Russian leadership for the crime of aggression. Today, we will focus on indeed the violations that have resulted from this aggression and what challenges Ukraine and the international community have in terms of documenting and responding to these violations. And I'm happy to give the floor to Ms. Zera Kozleva. She will be speaking in Ukrainian. So for those of you who do not understand Ukrainian yet, please use the interpretation, choose English. And I have already introduced Zera, but I haven't mentioned that apart from being a person who's instrumental in designing Ukraine's investigative and prosecutorial strategy concerning the conflict-related violations, she's also a representative of the Crimean Tatar community, of Ukraine's indigenous people from Crimea that have suffered greatly from the Russian regime during the Soviet times and who have another level of victimization during this new wave of aggression. Zera, we're very grateful that you are today with us. Over to you. And colleagues, you can already post your questions in the Q&A or chat function, and we will address them after our speakers make the initial remarks. Zera, please, thank you.
Can you hear me? Katerina, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I would like to welcome all of the participants of this webinar. I will try to speak slowly so that the interpreter could cope with her task and get my message across to all of you. I'm Zera Kozleva. I'm Deputy Chief of the Department on War Crimes in the Office of General Prosecutor of Ukraine. I need to hark back into the history of my being engaged in the investigation of war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law. I work in this field now, but I've been focusing on these issues since 2014, because it was in 2014 that the Office of General Prosecutor established a special department to investigate crimes committed in the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea and the city of Sebastopol. I've worked there for 6 months, and then in 2016, I returned to the sphere of investigating war crimes and crimes related to the occupation in the relocated prosecutor's office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Since then till today, I am in charge of organizing the investigation of war crimes, both in the occupied Crimea and in the region of Donbas. I would like to state from the outset that over these 8 years of Russia's war against Ukraine, it has been a huge challenge to our country, because neither the legislation nor the investigative or judicial practices were prepared to stand up to those challenges. And the war has been on for 8 years, but we still haven't got the international humanitarian law instrument or international criminal law instruments implemented into the national legislative framework. Hence, these challenges to our law enforcement agencies. We have to operate beyond the national legislative framework within which the prosecutorial bodies and law enforcement agencies were used to operate. So far, we have got only 3 sentences under Article 433, just violation of war of rules and customs of war. And it's an article that contains 4 elements of crime, and there's a 4th part about other violations of international treaties ratified by Ukrainian parliament. So this 5th provision covers all of the crimes that are to be found in the Rome Statute, and it had not been applied before the beginning of this current large-scale war. Because the situation in the temporarily occupied Donbas and Crimea and the mainland of Ukraine, the difficulty is also because of the lack of access to the territories where active hostilities are underway. So the investigators of war crimes now have to investigate or to carry out such proceedings without being able to access those territories. So the methodology of collecting evidence that we are used to is not applicable today to the investigation of crimes related to the armed conflict. At the same time, I have to tell you about the achievements of our law enforcement authorities and prosecutorial bodies. So as I told you, the prosecutor's office of the city of Sebastopol and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea was relocated to Kiev. Since then, certain institutional changes have been implemented with the strategy for the operation of this relocated prosecution being approved. and adopted to the conditions of the armed conflict. In addition, back in 2019, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine established a separate department, dedicated department that I am currently representing, and that's the department charged with coordinating and organizing activities related to the investigation of crimes committed in Crimea and in Donbas, irrespective of the specific body of the prosecutor's office, because those cases were scattered all over the territory of the country. It took us 2 years to achieve institutional development and enhancement of this department, with a series of trainings for the prosecutor's office of the Crimean Autonomous Republic. And we worked in close cooperation with the expert community, including international experts, civil society organizations. The aim of that cooperation was to have our employees trained in the international humanitarian law and international criminal law for the prosecutors and investigators engaged in this effort, and then concerting all of our efforts in documenting violations amounting to war crimes or crimes against humanity. This said, I can tell you that as of 2021, a lot of effort had been put into developing this institutional capacity of the prosecutorial bodies and law enforcement authorities to organize and coordinate investigation of international crimes in the territories of temporarily occupied Crimean Peninsula and Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. When it comes to the 24th of February and the all-out war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, with the escalation of the armed conflict in the entire territory of our country. That meant yet another challenge to all of us, since crimes are being committed all across Ukraine, and procedural legislation of Ukraine, where the principle of territoriality or territorial jurisdiction is observed. So all prosecutorial bodies that exist in Ukraine become now responsible for investigating such crimes. Even those that knew nothing about war crimes or investigating such crimes or with the legal regime of the armed conflict, had to respond to such violations or crimes right now, because in their respective oblasts or regions, in their respective townships, such crimes are taking place now. And a large share, I would not give you the exact figure, but a large share of registering, documenting, and investigating such violations is the responsibility of prosecutorial bodies. Yet another challenge is that the prosecutors and investigators in various oblasts of Ukraine are not properly trained in the main provisions and basics of international humanitarian law. That's why we have started to actively invite international organizations and Ukrainian experts to organize such trainings very rapidly everywhere, in every oblast of Ukraine. So prosecutors and investigators conduct such or participate in such trainings. We develop the training programs and curricula, and as a result, most of the facts of such crimes are being documented and investigations are being organized. So now we are investigating more than 7,000 of violations that are classified as war crimes or other international crimes.
Thank you for providing the overview of your work. since 2014, and thank you also for stressing the challenges that are currently facing, because understandably, previously just with Crimea, and Donbas, now you experience the need to investigate and prosecute and to document first and foremost across the much larger territories. I'm now happy to give the floor to Mr. Wayne Jordas, who, as I said, he and his team have been hands-on engaged on the issues of Crimea and Donbas in Ukraine since 2015. Ukraine is also now a special advisor on international criminal law to the prosecutor general. And Wayne, we will be very grateful to hear your impressions about how the institutional capacity, how the legislative capacity of Ukraine has changed with a new wave of invasion in terms of the ability to respond to conflict-related atrocities. And also, are you concerned about the proliferation of the documentation initiatives from the civil society, from international courts, and what is the way to harmonize those initiatives? Thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Katya, and thank you to Chatham House. That's quite a lot of subjects to cover in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. I think the best place to start in terms of what I've observed since 2014, 2015, is the changing nature of the crimes being committed, the proliferation of crimes being committed, especially since 24th of February of this year, and the patterns that appear to be emerging, and the challenges that those patterns bring to any domestic or international prosecutor trying to investigate and prosecute these types of crimes. Prior to the 24th of February of this year, the patterns essentially, and I'm going to generalize just for the purposes of this discussion, but largely were persecutory type crimes, which were designed in both Crimea and in Donbas to maintain the Russian hold over the territory. Crimea, very straightforward, forcibly took over the territory. Anyone who opposed was subject to persecutory type crimes ranging from torture to forcible displacement to arbitrary detention and so on. In Donbas, although the Russian government was able to hide a bit, it was obvious once you analyze what's happening. They were in overall control of the non-state armed groups, and the non-state armed groups have been controlled by the Kremlin, again to maintain their hold on the territory, and the purpose of that was to maintain political control to the extent that was possible over the Ukrainian government, and in large part to pressurize the Ukrainian government to sign the Minsk agreement, which would have given the Kremlin a sort of hold over the Ukrainian government. So persecutory type offences against those who opposed the non-state armed groups' effective control over the territory. And of course, such things as indiscriminate shelling from the non-state armed groups into the territory of Ukraine, which was still under the control of the Ukrainians. Now, since the 24th of February, things have changed somewhat and become much more complicated. And the patterns are more tricky to follow because, in fact, they're evolving. From the outset, there's no doubt that the Russian forces were responsible for a range of war crimes, willful killing, torture, inhumane treatment, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, and so on and so forth. This was the first phase of the war when the Kremlin imagined that 50% of the Ukrainian population wanted Putin to take over. And a percentage could then be coerced and frightened into lending their support. That was, from what I can see, the pattern of the crimes. So you have towns such as Budianka, which is outside of Kiev, which was subjected to bombing of residential buildings, of civilian infrastructure, not because there was any military combat there, but just because the Russians wanted to control it, and they wanted to use it as a supply route into Kiev, and they wanted the population to be cowed by attacks on them and attacks on their structures. Of course, as we all know, this didn't happen. The Ukrainians declined Putin's kind offer and resisted. And thereafter, what appears to be the case is that a widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population emerged. I say appears to, I've got no doubt that there is a widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population, and the Kremlin is responsible for it. This, though, is a pattern. It's a moment when the Kremlin appears to have realized that the Ukrainian civilians were going to resist, and so the civilian population became fair game. Thereafter, the Kremlin appears to appreciate that whatever force they used against the Ukrainians wasn't going to stop them from resisting. And then we move into such incidents, systematic violations, as we've seen in Bucha, where the question of genocide most certainly raises its ugly head. Now, I lay out those patterns because the patterns are important, and the motive, although motive is not an essential element of proving a war crime or a crime against humanity, it's important, I think, to see these patterns developing, because it shows you, number one, that we have almost certainly at least three core crimes being committed: crime of aggression, crime against humanity, and war crimes, and quite possibly genocide. That makes a prosecutor's job extremely complicated. And of course, the War Crimes Unit in the Prosecutor General's office are now, as Zara has just pointed out, many of them are experienced, especially the War Crimes Unit within Ukraine. They have very good lawyers who raise their skills and really practice their trade over the last 7 or 8 or less than that, maybe 5 or 6 years. They have really good experts, but nonetheless, this is challenging. This is challenging to those who've been doing this job for 20 years. It's challenging to those who've been doing it for 5 years. It's even more challenging when you're doing it in the middle of an armed conflict. And so the challenges faced by the Prosecutor General's office is the challenge faced by all international courts, international prosecutors, and it's essentially, I would say, two. There are many challenges, of course, but two headlines I would like to sort of just focus on very briefly. One is coordination, and two is prioritization. Coordination. It is absolutely essential to, if you want to get the best result, that the Prosecutor General coordinates with international experts and also civil society. Prosecutor General, I've spoken to a number of prosecutors in the War Crimes Unit. They're very keen. They understand that very keenly. And understand just on a practical level that they can't work in certain places because they're a target where there's ongoing conflict and the Russians understand that they're being investigated, then they can't work. Civil society can work in those places and can work more discreetly. Some victims prefer to speak to civil society. International experts are part of the picture. They can provide longer standing expertise and can inject expertise when and where it's needed. And so in order to really be effective, you need coordination of all three constituents. At the moment, I would say that is an ongoing process, and one which is challenging, as it often is in armed conflict situations or post-conflict situations. The Prosecutor General and their office, I think, are reaching out and doing their best. There's some resistance in civil society. That's another story, but it really does need improvement. As for international experts and the risk of proliferation, I think the risk of proliferation is really there. international lawyers want to help. International lawyers want to be involved in the Ukrainian situation. However, international lawyers don't necessarily want to move from their nice Western offices and come to an a place where armed conflict is still ongoing. And therein lies one risk of the proliferation. Lots of advisory units, advisory experts, but actually what's needed at the moment, as I'm sure Zara will confirm, are people on the ground who are able to go with the Prosecutor General's office into the areas where the crimes have been committed and work with them on a day-to-day basis. Yes, strategic advice is critical. Everything has to work to a strategic approach, but in fact, what's needed is help on the ground for the prosecutors, for the State Security Service and the National Police, who are all doing their best to document some very serious and very widespread and very systematic crimes. I'm going to stop there, and I can pick up on the Q&A. But I would just before I do just describe what is happening in the field. There are literally hundreds of prosecutors, national police and state security doing their best to record and document what has happened. And this quite quickly goes to my second point, prioritization. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. You can't do everything. If you try to log and record every piece of destruction, every harm to a civilian that's been done at the hands of the Russians since the 24th of February, never mind since 2014, it's a lifelong work, and it won't work in the end. So prioritization. What should you focus on? What is a war crime? What is not a crime? And unfortunately, not every attack on a civilian is a war crime. What should be focused on that is a war crime, that is a crime against humanity, which will it arrive in a courtroom? Is there a prospect of it arriving in a courtroom? And if not, should you leave it, or should you take another approach to it? So these are the sorts of questions that I think have to be answered when you're faced with such widespread and systematic crimes. And as I say, coordination is critical to achieve the best results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wayne, for always sobering assessment, but I think sobering with so much realism and willingness to help. Thank you, Wayne. And now we turn to Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. And Elliot, we would really love to hear how the patterns of the crimes that you are documenting now in relation to Ukraine have changed. What are perhaps the different methods that you are now using to document the results of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and perhaps you could also briefly comment how your previous work in relation to Russia in Syria, in relation to MH17 is informing your work now. Thank you.
So all the work we're doing at the moment really has been informed by our experiences with the conflict in Syria and our work in Ukraine from 2014 onwards. We understand that there is a vast amount of digital evidence available from open sources, but we also understand that volume of evidence is very hard to collect, to archive, to make accessible in the future. With Syria, we've been working with an organisation called Mnemonic Labs for a number of years, and they started as the Syrian Archive, archiving digital content on the conflict in Syria, mainly through open sources. And at the moment, I believe they have over 3.5 million different videos and photographs from Syria. So as conflicts continue, you get more and more information. And making that information accessible is extremely important. And making that accessible to accountability is something that we're focusing on at the moment. So from the first days of the conflict, what we started doing is collecting a database of open source evidence, specifically focused on civilian casualties, because there is so much digital evidence out there that we do have to focus on certain kinds of incidents. One thing we do there is make sure every single one of these videos or photographs we collect is geolocated. What's been quite interesting with Ukraine that we've not really seen before is a community formed very rapidly around the conflict online, who are basically an ad hoc amateur volunteer community who are finding videos, geolocating them, sharing information from each other. And part of what we do is actually draw from that, because if someone has geolocated a video, it's very easy to double check that geolocation versus the time it takes to geolocate a video from scratch. Could be a number of hours versus a number of seconds. So that, first of all, allows us to, because of that community, very quickly process this information. We have a team called the Global Authentication Project. That is a group of trained volunteers. We train them both in geolocation and give them trauma training as well to ensure they aren't being traumatized by the material they're working with. They verify it again, and then we also have a Bellingcat staff member who then verifies it again. So we have, before this stuff enters our database, we have three basically groups of people who are geolocating these videos. And over time, we're building a database of these videos. If you go to ukraine.bellingcat.com, you can actually see a map of videos that we are sharing from that database, where we've been able to share videos where there isn't a risk of witnesses being exposed or any of the risks to people involved with that information being shared. And we also share with a delay, so it can't be used by Russia or any other forces to adjust their targeting or anything like that. So the reason we're collecting that is because we understand that despite the impression many people have that if something's on the internet, it's going to be there forever, that's really not true. Content is taken down all the time. With Syria, we saw literally hundreds of thousands of videos disappear overnight as YouTube started shutting down channels. So archiving that material is very important, and that's not just a case of downloading a video, it's a case of downloading it in a way that makes it forensically useful for accountability purposes. So again, working with Economic Labs, they're going through all the links that we have in our database, and they're archiving them forensically. And alongside that, we have the data and geolocation data. And what that creates is a searchable database. Because now it might not see there's a huge amount of incidents to look into, but in a year's time, in 2 or 5 years' time, as we saw with Syria, this becomes a massive data management task. So a really big part of what we're trying to do is create a searchable data set. Already we have a lot of human rights organizations, accountability bodies, and NGOs reaching out for this data. Even from the first days of the conflict, we were contacted by all sorts of organizations who are asking for this information. Often it's because they don't have the capability to collect, basically do what we're doing with this, verify and archive this information in the initial moments of the conflict. That might come later, but a lot of information can be lost. And that's also something we're very aware of thanks to our experience with Syria and Ukraine in 2014 onwards. So what we've been trying to do is collect as much as we can, showing civilian casualties. That's then being shared with these accountability bodies. We're already seeing that being used in various reports that have been published so far. It's used for things, for example, not just legal accountability, but directing the efforts of organizations working on safety around unexploded ordnance, or documenting the use of cluster munitions so they can direct efforts to certain areas. Now, this is not to say that we're attempting to replace the work of any process. We see this open source evidence as something that can be combined with the other information that's being collected by investigators. There is obviously a lot of really important work being done on the ground, and that I think will play a very key role in what's happening with regards to accountability. But one thing we're also trying to do is create this archive not just for accountability, but also the historic memory of what has happened in this conflict. So, in 10, 20, 30 years' time, these images are still available. They can be viewed that no matter who the victor is in this conflict, that history will not be written by them, it's being written now by the people documenting the conflict. And we're making sure that stuff is being preserved for future use. Now, that's kind of the first stage of what we're doing. The next thing we're doing is we are also working on open source investigations, and over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working with the Global Legal Action Network on developing a process for investigation that is specifically intended for those investigations to be used by accountability processes and in courts. So they are designed around making sure they can answer the kind of questions that will be asked about them in court by judges, defense lawyers, prosecutions. That includes a process where, as we're actually doing the online investigations, all that material is being archived. Every website we visit, every search term we use, every click we're doing is being preserved forensically. So if ever we have to go to court and explain how we found something, we actually have a record of exactly how we did it and exactly what we were looking at when we did that. Anything that's a key file is also preserved forensically, and we can add that to our database of geolocated videos and photographs that is also accessible as a separate kind of strand of information. And the idea is that when we come to the end of this research process on each of these incidents, we have a complete open source case file, so to speak, and that can be handed over to whichever accountability organization wants to use it, or be made available to other organizations who are investigating incidents who will find that information useful. So we have the kind of archiving and collection side of things, the investigation side of things. What I'm working on personally at the moment is the next stage of this, because we see the work we're doing with archiving information and investigating information as something that's teachable and trainable to other organizations. And we've certainly seen there's a demand for that. So we're turning those into something that we plan to train other organizations to do in the future. But then that will create multiple archives of information. And the one thing that's very important there is what we discovered with Syria, working with the IIMM on Syria, who was set up by the UN General Assembly to investigate incidents in Syria, whilst often organizations don't want to share their archives with one centralized organization, especially it's an organization that's a UN organization where Russia is a member. So what we have to create is a decentralized network of archives, but a centralized indexing system. So what we're doing at the moment is we're working with Economic Labs, we're working with Benetech and other organizations to create an indexing system and a platform for searching that index, where the intent is that archives will be able to index that information, and they can add whichever metadata they like to that index. It can be very detailed, or it can be something quite simple. For example, if you have a witness statement, you may just want to say this date, this location, and there's a witness statement rather than revealing the full identity. That is then indexed. You can search that index using a simple platform. You can do a kind of geo-fence search of an area with a date. So if you know there's an incident in a town, you can search for all the archives at once, and then you can make a secure file request between the archive to your organization. And we envision that being organizations like the International Criminal Court. So for me, it's really about making this digital evidence as accessible as possible and as quickly as possible. And we've certainly seen there's a really big desire from international accountability bodies and NGOs to access that kind of information. And the challenge is making that information as accessible as possible to those organizations as quickly as possible and in a way that is forensically sound and secure. So really for us at the moment at Bellingcat, those are the kind of three stages of what we're trying to do. I mean, as it comes to the kind of incidents we're seeing, I mean, everyone I think probably on this call is familiar with what's happening. Mass use of cluster munitions, indiscriminate attacks, civilians being targeted, just terrific incidents that are happening across Ukraine. And of course, we also have the angle of having to deal with the disinformation as well. For me, it's actually been surprising how bad Russian disinformation has been. I mean, we've had years of disinformation from Syria and Ukraine being debunked. And I kind of thought that we would see Russia upping its game, because what we have seen is on the kind of public community open source side of things, people coming together and becoming very, very good at using open source material to debunk disinformation, and sometimes very, very rapidly before it can really enter the disinformation ecosystems. And Russia's disinformation has not improved. It's almost as if they've swapped the words Syria with Ukraine and jihadists with Nazis in many cases. It's exactly the same lies being told. I mean, sometimes, talking about serial numbers of missiles, they did that with MH17. It's almost absurd, but it's still very important to address this information, but also be aware that there is a lot of important accountability work being done, and there shouldn't be allowed to be a distraction from that. Russia will try and make the conflict and the evidence of incidents about one incident in particular. We'll focus its energy on that rather than the massive incidents that are taking place. And it's my hope that we can document these incidents as widely as possible.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And now we're turning to the questions and answer session. And thanks a lot to everybody who had already posted their questions. Elliot, but if I may, I will use my position of a moderator today and pose the first question to you, because you said that you document and you create the archives not only for accountability but for historical memory. And you also spoke about disinformation and the Guardian published an article today in the morning with respect to Bucha, and they said that the surge of the Facebook resharing post has showed that the resharing of the post doubting the atrocities in Bucha were actually 3 times higher than those that actually called for the accountability. And my question to you would be that with this amount of not just the open source evidence, but the open source evidence from such reputable sources and analysis, how do you think we still counter these disinformation that the Guardian has just written about?
I think sometimes it can give a misleading understanding of actually how information is being shared, because what you find with these kind of counterfactual communities that emerge around any subject really is they're kind of very intensely engaged around specific topics. So they will talk about one particular claim about one incident, and they repeat it, examine it, share it. They'll have the various kind of celebrities in the counterfactual community come along and say how it's all fake and it's not real, and some fake expert will come along. And they will constantly kind of bounce it around in their echo chamber. So it creates a lot more intense activity around one particular thing. But outside in the kind of more mainstream discourse, people are actually talking about a much broader range of topics rather than focusing on one thing. So if you focus on one particular topic, it can actually make it appear that there's a lot more kind of intense disinformation about war crimes, when in fact it's about that one specific topic. Because you often see this, and you saw this, for example, with the Doom chemical attack in Syria, where these counterfactual communities kind of hyper-focus on one instance where they feel that can kind of represent all the accusations against the side of the conflict that they support. They say, well, if this is a lie, if this is a lie, everything else must be a lie, which is completely false. But this is really how they operate as communities. And we've seen the same pattern of behavior repeat time and time again. We've seen it with MH17, we've seen it with chemical attacks in Syria, and really the impact happens when those kind of network that makes up the counterfactual community starts spraying it over into the kind of more mainstream discourse. You saw that to a certain extent with the Doom chemical attacks in Syria, where you had people like Peter Hitchens, for example, in the Daily Mail writing stories that supported theories that were effectively conspiracy theories about the Doom chemical attack. But it's a kind of repeating pattern of behavior we see time and time again. And the thing is, there are always going to be people who reject what they consider mainstream narratives. There's a whole number of reasons for this. I kind of think of it of terms in this kind of traumatic moral injury, where sometime in the past a source of authority has done something that has made them feel betrayed, and that might be completely legitimate. Often it's the build-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where people end up not trusting the government, and then that becomes a lens through which they view everything. So if the West is saying that Putin is bad, it must mean that Putin is actually good, because the West is the ones that we know are liars and they're always bad. And it's a very simplistic worldview, but it informs the way these counterfactual communities think, and you always have people reinforcing that. So what we have to do more is actually prevent people becoming part of those counterfactual communities in the first place. The best way to do that is provide not only useful information, but show them how to think critically, how they can be involved with those investigations in the first place. And for me, it's been very reassuring with the conflicts in Ukraine, how the kind of community formed around the conflict, who did that, very much looking at the evidence, sharing it with each other, debunking disinformation, in a way becoming the kind of white blood cells of the kind of body of the information ecosystem. And I think we need to encourage that more proactively. We've certainly done that with the work with Bellingcat, but I think we really need to be going into schools and teaching students how to do this, not just hoping people figure it out for themselves, because people will more often figure out they find a group that reinforces our ideas about how the West always lies and Putin's actually a really great guy and it's all propaganda against him.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And Wayne, I proceed with a question from Tisa Abe. I'm very sorry if I'm pronouncing the surname wrong. To you. So Tisa is asking, if certain atrocities committed in Ukraine go to the ICC, would they be qualified as genocide or crimes against humanity or both? And just in relation to this question, I would refer our audience to the brilliant panel discussion discussion last week, which actually Wayne participated in, it was on war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, all alleged, of course, co-organized by Chatham House, Atlantic Council and LibMod. So Wayne, perhaps in your response, you could also comment a little bit on the possible genocide allegations and also whether the same conduct could be qualified under several counts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question. Let me go back to. Oh, let me start with saying this. That I think the question of genocide, I think, has been overly focused on Bucha and also Mariupol. As I said when I gave my presentation, in fact, I think the answer to what the crimes are is often about just following the patterns and following the escalation and following the motive and how the motive changes, the purpose of the crimes, what's sought to be achieved in the strategic sense, and I think that is where we should look for the answer as to whether genocide has been committed in Bucha. So one way of doing that would be to look at what was the Kremlin's purpose or motive in 2014 in taking over Donbas and Crimea. What was their motive and purpose when they first started the invasion of Ukraine this time around, 24th of February? And I think what's happening on the ground then is obviously critical. What's also happening in terms of Kremlin speech is also important. If you remember when the 24th of February invasion started, Putin, of course, he was talking about many different things. Rambling is a kind way of looking at it. But he wanted to denazify the country, and at that point, denazification was essentially to decapitate the government, was to kill the government, and to install a puppet government. The people, the Ukrainian people, were effectively slaves to a Nazi government, and as we saw the conflict progress, we saw the presentation by the state agency, I think RAA Novosti, I think it's called, who then presumably at the behest of Putin, or with his acquiescence at the very least, put forward a theory that all Ukrainians were Nazis, and they needed to be cleansed. To cleanse Nazi culture, or to denazify was going to take not just killing the government, but also people who supported them. They were guilty by virtue of being Ukrainians. An interesting shift from killing the government to killing Ukrainians for being Ukrainians. And I think when you look at that evolution of that speech and the evolution of what's happening on the ground, you begin to see how war crimes, which are perhaps systematic but not widespread necessarily at the beginning, and maybe not even systematic at the beginning. But then you move to what is a crime against humanity is an attack of different forms of attack, killing, forcible displacement, torture, and so on, within the context of a widespread or systematic attack on the population. That's why I say you go to the patterns. So Ukrainians were resisting, Ukrainians were not welcoming Putin, and so the attack on civilians escalated and became systematic, i.e. became something that was planned by the Kremlin in order to suppress and force the Ukrainian people into supporting Russian takeover. Widespread widespread number of crimes, frequency of crimes increased. And so you moved into what I would say quite confidently widespread and systematic crimes, and therefore crimes against humanity. And I think then the question about genocide, and the ICC needs to look at this. Some commentators say, no, definitely not genocide. I'm not so confident. When you look at the patterns, the escalation, the speeches coming out of the Kremlin, and you look at what happened in Bucha, you look at the killings, you look at the physical and mental harm, you look at the forcible transferring of an estimated 120,000 children, which, as you will know, is an enumerated act of genocide. When you put these together and you combine it with the rhetoric, this is beginning to look like genocide. So I'm not confidently saying it is, but it's looking very much like it. It might be. And I think the ICC needs to look very carefully at all three crimes and can prosecute and can investigate and prosecute all three crimes and can find all three crimes against individuals. So that's the task at hand, and not just for the ICC, of course, also for the Prosecutor General. The Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine, the Prosecutor General is very alive to that. She is determined, I would say, to look at all three and to look at it in a very careful, rigorous way, not come to assumptions, but to come to an appreciation and conclusions which will stand the test of time and also stand the rigors of international scrutiny. I think that she's approaching it in the right way with that open mind.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And now a question from Roland Smith to Zera. Zera, there have been the allegations about the crimes allegedly also perpetrated by Ukrainians. In particular, there have been allegations that Ukrainian soldiers have shot Russian prisoners of war, which would be a war crime. Could you please comment on whether the Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors do this in these cases, and what is the progress?
Thank you very much for this question. Yeah, this video reflecting this possible ill treatment is known to us. As far as I remember, it was also part of the Moscow mechanism report, and we received a relevant request or inquiry. And the inquiry also concerned the response of Ukrainian law enforcement to such alleged violations by the armed forces of Ukraine. I can assure you that according to the Criminal Procedural Code of Ukraine, we are bound to include these data or enter these data to the Unified Register of Pre-Court Investigations, and we register all of these applications from either the individuals or from other law enforcement agents, or else from the mass media outlets. So we are now verifying this information, and the investigation is underway. It is coordinated by specialized prosecutorial office in the defense and security sphere. So they are in charge of investigating any crimes allegedly committed by the Ukrainian military. So that's their cup of tea, if you wish. That is a department of the Office of Prosecutor General that actually presides over investigation of crimes committed by the military.
Thank you very much, Zera. And now we have a question to Elliot from Anastasia Fairchild. Really interested to hear about the idea of a decentralized network of archives with a centralized indexing system. Are you relying on any specific precedents to construct the infrastructure of such a database? Has anything of a similar scale you're envisioning been done before concerning any other armed conflict? And what kind of a lead time do you foresee for a project like this before it could be operational, so to say?
So I apologize to the interpreter in advance for this. This might get a bit complicated. So Benetech is an organization we've been aware of for a while. They've been working on various systems, one of which is a system that basically examines videos, photographs, and other kinds of files and creates a unique 500-character ID for it. And that ID is based on the content of those videos. That means if, for example, you have two archives and they've downloaded the same YouTube video, they will have the same indexing number. So first of all, this is very useful when you have many archives that have been downloading open source information and they may have the same videos. Because first of all, it allows you to deduplicate videos. You know, if you've got 3.5 million videos like the Syrian archive, you might discover that, you know, 1 million of them are actually duplicates of videos that were just reshared on various channels. So from a storage and management sense, it's very useful. It also means that if you have an index and it has, so you have the index number, you then have metadata associated with that index number. At the most basic, it would be something like the date and location. And the location can either be something that's been precisely geolocated, or it can just be, it's in a town or a location. It doesn't have to be 100% precise, but it could be. So this means you can search through this index in a variety of ways. One way we want the platform to function is you would basically have a map. You can highlight a town and then set a date range, and it will list every single indexed item in that town on that date. You'll then press a button, which then sends requests to each of the archive that holds those items, and it sends a direct transfer from that archive to the body in question. So whilst the index is centralized, there's never information going directly through that index. So even if you get hacked access to the index, you would always have the protocols in place that shows that you can request this information. It's about making it as secure as possible and ensuring only information the archivers want shared with the index is actually shared. Now, this means you can start doing some very interesting things with it, because if you have these index numbers that allow you to look for identical videos in other archives, it means that if, say, you have 20 archives and 10 of them have archived a video from YouTube and they all have metadata on, if one of those archives has incorrect metadata and the other 9 have the same metadata, it creates a kind of mode of error checking in it as well. So you can compare metadata to other metadata automatically and highlight where there's major discrepancies. So that means if you are working for organizations, and our hope is we'll be training these organizations, so they should be doing it right. If they're getting it wrong, and they're getting it wrong a lot, that will be highlighted very, very rapidly. It also means if, say, Bellingcat writes a report and we use 20 videos, and these are archived videos. When you find those videos on the index, it will also link to the report that we've written about them. So if you're researching something, you can immediately find all the associated reports that are linked to certain files. And if those files are also indexed in 10 other archives, and you find one in one archive, it will show you that this investigation has also been done. So it also makes it a lot more accessible for organizations to find the research that's already been done. You can also do some really interesting things with this Benetech system, because it not only finds identical files, it also finds very similar files. And very similar can be files that have been edited in different ways, have a different soundtrack, and even files that show the same location, but filmed from a slightly different angle, in that they're actually different videos. Now, when you have a large number of videos, what this allows you to do is say, you have one geolocated video, and then you can have 50 videos that are very similar that aren't geolocated, but you can group them together, feed them into a verification process like we have with our global authentication project, and check if they're actually showing the same location from a slightly different angle. It doesn't even have to be the same day. So you can actually create a process where you rapidly geolocate a large number of videos in one area. And that allows something else to happen as well. If you have a large number of geolocated videos and photographs, and you can find similar ones, if you get a new video, you can index it and it will immediately show you similar videos without having to geolocate it first. In a sense, it gives you a way to do near auto geolocation at large scale. And when we look at something like Syria, we're talking about, as I said before, literally millions of videos, millions of points of data. You can also do various other projects like them. Like we're already tagging videos with details like an instant type or a specific type of munition that's featured. if you're doing, for example, machine learning to detect objects, which is already being done with the Mnemonic Labs work using a profile, something called VFrame to identify cluster munitions, you can actually send a request out saying, I want every video that's tagged with this kind of cluster munition, get those and actually pull it into a machine learning process, which will try and identify those munitions and help the machine learning algorithm to learn how to identify specific objects, say the munitions tanks, so on and so forth. And some of this work has already been done with cluster munitions. Forensic Architecture did it with tanks in a battle in Ukraine. And it gives you access basically to a massive data set that you can use for all kinds of different research. So it's not just about indexing this information, it's also about saying, how do we turn this information into something that's even more useful for accountability? And how can you use that for projects that allow this information to be examined far more rapidly? So as to regards how quickly we were hoping to do it, we actually have all the moving parts. We have an archive, we have metadata, we have the index already indexing the stuff on the Mnemonic Labs archives. What we're really lacking is the platform to pull it on. Things that's not that difficult. Some of you may be aware of a platform called EchoSec, which allows you to search for geotagged social media posts. And it's effectively the same thing as we're doing. It's just rather than searching on Twitter, you're searching for an archive, an index of an archive. So it isn't that difficult to produce, and we're just at the moment putting that together. I'm hoping it'll be quite rapid. When I initially planned this, I started planning this in January before everything happened. I was thinking this will take us a couple of years to put together because it's a big project. And the work we're doing now, I was thinking this will take us a year or two to do, just having the process for archiving and investigation. But it's sped things up dramatically because there is a large amount of interest now in actually making this information accessible. And I really hope it won't take us more than, I wouldn't want to put a date on it because it is software development, and that is something that will get you in trouble if you start putting dates on it. But even if it's not ready in the next year, we're going to have a system that I'm hoping will be ready and teachable to other organizations in the future. And a lot of work we're doing at Bellingcat at the moment is basically trying to work with pre-established networks of organizations in different regions of the world and teach them the methodologies we use. And part of that will be, if they're interested, archiving and indexing and making it accessible for these platforms. So in the future, even if we can't get it working for Ukraine now, and I will put every ounce of effort I have to make sure it can be, but even if we can't, we will make sure it's ready for other organizations and other conflicts in the future. So this data is ready from day one for those organizations. And something else I'm also thinking of is an organization called Witness is developing basically a file type that is designed specifically for the collection of evidence. And it's based off the work of on InformaCam, which was a digital camera app that was used to collect metadata and make kind of forensically sound files at the moment of collection. There's been other efforts like the Eyewitness on Atrocity app. My hope is that we can actually have people using those apps, capturing data, uploading it, immediately having it indexed. And because it's already been kind of collected with all the metadata in a forensically sound way, immediately appearing on these indexes. So this information will be available without the need of even having to go through the full geolocation process. It will just be there as the kind of complete package, indexed and available for accountability processes as rapidly as possible, hopefully within minutes, if not hours, of the file being ready. So that's kind of my big picture goal in the future.
Thank you very much for such a detailed response, Elliot. And we now have a question from Nina Stefan concerning conflict-related sexual violence, which I would ask both Zera and Wayne to comment on. So there have been these horrific accounts of sexual violence in this new wave of invasion, and there have been even the accounts with the alleged genocidal rhetorics, because several women reported that the Russian service people who raped them said that they would do that in a way that those women would not want to have sex with Ukrainian men anymore and would not want to bear the Ukrainian children anymore. So we have a question in relation to rape and other forms of sexual violence from Nina Stefan. She asks, what is the progress with domestic investigations and prosecutions, and what are their chances for success? And also, what is the advice for the NGOs to document this type of violence? Because, we know from Ukraine as of now, it's predominantly the NGOs that the survivors first get in touch with. So is there any particular recommendation how to approach this particularly vulnerable group of survivors, and what would be the best way to document the crime they have been subjected to? Please, Zara, and then Wayne.
Thank you very much for your question, an extremely important question. The Office of Prosecutor General focuses on this category of cases. At this juncture, we, in cooperation with national experts, have developed an instruction for the regional prosecutorial offices how to interview survivors of sexual violence. We did so because the methodology of investigation and the procedure of interviewing individual crimes according to the criminal code, and as sexual and gender-based violence related to conflict is a bit different. So we have to understand the sensitivity and latency of such crimes and the psychological state and status of the survivors. And the stats that we've got and the stats that is available in the open sources and that provided by NGOs differ. So there are few such cases that have been already instituted, first of all, because of the lack of trust in the law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities. On the other hand, the survivors might be reluctant to have their testimony documented and then have to testify during the court proceedings. And survivors do indeed trust NGOs more. But if we are speaking about prosecuting the perpetrators of those crimes, then the survivors should actually cooperate with the law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities. Why am I saying that? Because there is this issue of re-victimization, and an individual who suffered from such a crime would be interviewed several times by different players. Those could be documenters, there could be journalists, then law enforcement, then investigators, and our criminal procedural law recognizes as admissible evidence the statement of the survivor or the victim that is made actually in the court trial. So all of the statements made at the pre-trial investigation state have to be reiterated in the trial court. So working with this category of crisis is not easy. I'll give you an example. If you are interviewing, if you are an investigative judge and you are interviewing the survivor, say for 2 or 3 times, so you can have that in different stages without returning to the same question or same issue several times. If a survivor has to actually make one and the same statement several times, then mostly she would be re-traumatized several times. So, and it is an issue that Wayne raised before, right? That lack of coordination in the process of documenting such crimes. So we have to achieve coordination amongst the law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities, and then with the civil society and international experts and the mass media. We understand that the methodology of investigating such crimes should be very specific. And if we concert our efforts in investigating such crimes, then the human rights organizations that represent the survivors could be allowed to participate in the court procedures. Then the data and the evidence collected at a pre-trial stage could be deemed admissible in the court of trial. And then the effective investigation and prosecution of the culprits would be made more effective and efficient. That's what I wanted to tell you.
Wayne, could you comment, please, on Ukraine's efforts to investigate and prosecute sexual violence between 2014 and 2022? Because we know that only the first communication to the International Criminal Court was being prepared on sexual violence, but as I understand, wasn't even submitted throughout the 8 years of the conflict. And where does it leave the Ukrainian state and also the civil society in terms of their readiness to address this new, much larger scope of rapes and other forms of sexual violence that we're seeing starting from February?
Well, I do think that between 2014 and 2017, there was a general presumption, and I suspect an erroneous presumption amongst both prosecutors and civil society, in fact, that sexual violence was not a part of the conflict in Crimea or in the Donbas. I always doubted that because the reports which were coming out, both, like I say, civil society documentation. We're not mentioning behavior which looked like sexual violence. The UN reports were not mentioning it, and the Prosecutor General's office were not focused on it. And I just thought it cannot be the case that you have an armed conflict where there is just no sexual violence. It's sadly, whilst it may not be widespread or systematic in some conflict, it's always a feature of armed conflict. Since 2017, I think there's been a general attempt by the prosecutor and the civil society to focus more and to try to understand where the problem is. Is it a problem of victims not reporting? Is it a problem of perpetrators being able to hide or conceal their crimes? Where is the problem? I think it took several years, I think, before progress was made, I think, by civil society and the prosecutor's office to try to work out what was happening and start to document it, which meant, of course, starting so late meant that not much action resulted. Now, since the 24th of February, I think there's been an absolute sea change in the prosecution, at least. I've had already numerous conversations with senior prosecutors who are absolutely focused on these crimes. At least I would say as much, if not more, than most other crimes. Of course, there's some questions and some learning to be had, and that's not a critique of the prosecution. That's just the nature of trying to investigate these crimes. They're always more difficult to investigate than other crimes. They always take longer to investigate than other crimes. Victims are often reluctant to report the crimes. As Zara mentioned, there's a muddying of the waters because journalists, when they find out there's a victim of sexual violence, rush to get headline reports, which is actually, it makes me pretty angry when I see that, because they arrive. It is, of course, raising awareness of these crimes is important, but how journalists can behave and how I've seen them behave in Ukraine recently in relation to sexual violence victims is the complete opposite of how I would advise an investigator to investigate these crimes. Best practice, it is not. And I think there's already a problem because there are victims within Ukraine who have now, as Sarah touched upon, been interviewed by journalists 4 or 5 times, by civil society a number of times. And of course, by the time the prosecution are able to approach them in a more rigorous and systematic way, they no longer want to cooperate. And that, of course, is only part of the problem. Another part of the problem is the stigma of reporting such crimes. Another part of the problem in this conflict is, why should I go through these difficulties of reporting such crimes when the Russian perpetrator is now back in Russia and may never face justice? Why would I do that to myself on top of what's just happened to me? So they're very challenging. I would say that the prosecution is very much focused on these issues. Zara spoke about one such capacity building exercise they're going through, but there's also more. We're about to provide the prosecution with best practice manual. We've got a senior prosecutor coming out next week to work with the prosecuting school of training. And I think there's a real sort of sense that the prosecution need to focus on these crimes and need to get it right, not for publicity purposes, but because frighteningly, these offences seem to be common. And we are yet to uncover, of course, what's happened in Mariupol and some of the cities in the south and the east. So, we do need to focus on these crimes, and we need to get it right. And it's going to be extremely challenging, and more challenging than some other conflicts, I would say, for the reasons I've just touched upon.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And we have a question to Elliot from Emmanuel Days. And Emmanuel asks, what's the future of the possibilities to gather, to document the crimes in the so-called smaller areas, which usually go unnoticed? For instance, are there tools and capabilities being developed that will allow virtually anyone, anywhere, to forensically document a potential war crime or genocide in a tiny village somewhere and bring it to the attention to those who can verify and then help to bring justice?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of certainly my hope of what we're trying to develop at the moment. The use of these kind of camera apps that are being developed and have been developed in the past were intended to kind of address that issue, to allow people to collect digital, video and photographic evidence in a way in which those files would be forensically sound and collect a large amount of metadata about how they were gathered in the first place. There's not to say that if you record a video, it has to be done in a forensically sound way. It just makes life easier when we're trying to authenticate the videos in the future. And if it is in a remote location, then you have very few options for kind of triangulating the information with other sources, and that can be very useful, but it's not 100% necessary. Often when you're focusing particularly on open source information, it's more about, in a sense, the number of sensors there are in with regards to, how many people have smartphones who can collect videos, who can then share them online. But I think, one thing that's been very interesting for me is how kind of the Ukrainian government has had people collecting evidence from the ground themselves and submitting it. We've seen already the International Criminal Court setting up a portal for information to be shared. So I often get people contacting me from Ukraine via emails saying we've collected this information, and being able to tell them you can submit it on a portal specifically intended for evidence collection is very important. The other thing to keep in mind as well, we focused entirely on open source information, because when you start dealing with witnesses or people contacting us and sending files, the kind of issues around things like chain of custody change significantly compared to finding information online through open sources. So how that's handled is a very different in different circumstances. So we're focusing purely on the open source stuff. But Yeah, I mean, often it really just comes down to people having the equipment, which can be as simple as a smartphone, to collect this stuff and share it. And having worked on things like the conflict in Yemen, investigations into Afghanistan, where there are less of that information, it's still possible to draw conclusions and do investigations based off that information. Having things like satellite imagery, for example, is very useful. Planet, who we use a lot for satellite imagery, has just announced they're launching even more satellites that will allow even higher resolution imagery at a more frequent rate next year. And having access to that information can be extremely useful. Already, we've been using that in combination with other sources to look at allegations from bodies that have only appeared when the Ukrainians arrived, and then having the satellite imagery to show that's not true. So it allows us not only to investigate, but also verify and debunk claims made by sides in the conflict about what's happened.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And another question to Wayne from Christian Siplik. Wayne, states have assisted Ukraine with criminal investigations in the past. Australia sent several Australian federal police officers to Ukraine to investigate the downing of MH17. In the short term, what would you suggest is the most effective way to encourage international investigators to travel to Ukraine? And in the long term, how should states preposition their resources to respond to the situations like this in the future? For instance, create investigative units, extraterritorial jurisdictions for war crimes, etc.
Oh, thank you for the question. And in fact, it's something that Zara and I and others engaged with the prosecution have been working on for the last 4 to 5 weeks. And it's now, I think, being publicized, which is a US and EU joint initiative to basically provide expert help to the prosecution to help them investigate these crimes. And what it essentially consists of is a advisory unit of senior prosecutors. These are prosecutors from the ICTY, the ICC, some of the most senior in the profession, combined with mobile justice units, which I'm taking charge of, and which essentially they consist of essentially 4 parts. One is a senior prosecutor stroke international criminal lawyer. One is an investigator. One is an open source, and I need to speak to Elliot very quickly, I think, about this. And one expert will be a publicity expert. And of course, there'll be a contingency fund to be able to bring in experts on an ad hoc basis. And the idea is, well, twofold. One is to be able to provide strategic advice to the prosecution, and importantly, to provide and insert expertise on the ground when it's needed. So to ensure, for example, when a new crime scene is exposed and there's a new investigation, that and the prosecution do not have a particular expert, a particular ballistics expert, or a particular international criminal law expert, that the mobile justice team can insert that expertise and work on the ground with the investigators. And the second purpose of it was to, and this was to me essential, was to provide a coordinating framework, because I just don't think it's very useful for senior prosecutors to suddenly turn up in Ukraine and go, I'm here to help. I'll be here for a week and then I'm gone. Or an investigator to come and do the same. I think it detracts from the work. It forces the prosecution to have to deal with a proliferation of assistance, which in the end is not real assistance. I've had to personally try to dissuade senior prosecutors who wanted to come here on a delegation to see what the Ukrainians were doing so that they could report back and maybe they can offer some creative help. It's like, really? That is not actually going to help. What's going to help is if we have a structure, and then assistance. Of course, the prosecutor needs assistance, but the assistance can then be built around the existing structures and can be organized, and rather than getting in the way or interfering with the prosecutor's job, it can help the prosecution. And that's the key. And this is something I've been banging on about for 4 weeks, which is the prosecutors do not need people to do the job for them. They need support to enable them to do the job that they're fully willing and committed to doing. And so everything needs to be formulated around that model. How can we help the prosecution to do the job that they want to do? Not how can we come in and do what we want to do, or take over, or run parallel investigations and so on. That's not really useful. I hope that answers the questions. I think I better stop before I rant and rave about a lack of coordination.
Wayne, thank you very much for this insight and for always being so critical about the certain traditions among international lawyers, and that you really want to bring people to Ukraine to help Ukraine. And Zara, are you still with us? There are two questions, both of which concern the alleged crime of deportation of Ukrainians, especially from Mariupol, but also from other areas. So could you comment a little bit on how these instances are documented, investigated, and also is there a particular lens through which you are looking at the deportation of children to Russia?
Thank you, Katerina, for this question. Yeah, criminal proceedings have been instituted, and those are being investigated by territorial units of the Security Service of Ukraine, and procedural oversight is carried out by Donetsk Oblast Prosecutorial Office. And this prosecutor's office is not a novice in investigating war crimes, and they know how to organize this kind of work. And there are hindrances there as well because of the active hostilities underway there. It is difficult to document all of the crimes committed there to the fullest possible extent. And it is difficult to establish the true number of people who were forcibly deported or transported. We have got a separate criminal case on the deportation of children, and then another one investigating the fact of forcible deportation. So we document all of the information from open sources, from witnesses and eyewitnesses, or even victims of this deportation. We've got a portal, War Crimes Gov.ua, where we receive notifications or reports of such crimes. We've got thousands of such applications or reports, including about the forcible deportation. Sometimes people do not understand that they have been victims of such type of a crime. And today there are certain attempts of the culprit to hide all traces of evidence of committing such a crime. So we've heard about mobile crematoria being deployed in the city of Mariupol. So they are trying to conceal those trails. They actually present these crimes as evacuation, knowing that civilians that are constantly shelled and bombed want to leave this territory. They are given quote unquote assistance with evacuation. They are evacuated to the territory of the Russian Federation. Then they are placed in different regions of the Russian Federation in certain camps. Sometimes they call it filtration camp. And sometimes their IDs are taken away, and then they are given some paperwork or some certificate while sending them to other regions of the Russian Federation. So now our major task is to collect sufficient evidential base to corroborate that this crime is taking place. So we receive this information primarily from witnesses and victims, from open sources, or by way of receiving those reports on our platform. And we talk with people remotely. We also interview people who were evacuated to safer regions of Ukraine, but know about such instances of forcible deportation. So there are, as I said, two types of cases that we are currently investigating, and I hope that we will have enough institutional capacity to develop specialized methodology of investigating such cases that will cover all the tools necessary to prove this sort of cases. So it was back in 2014 and 15 when we started investigating cases of changing demographic structure in certain localities in Crimea. And we were collecting evidence thereof. And this is still an open question, and it is a huge challenge, not only to our law enforcement system, but also to the international professional legal community. Since this is a hybrid warfare, and the Russian Federation resorts to various ways and tools of changing the demographic situation in the territories they occupy. They either oust indigenous people from those territories, like with Crimean Tatars, or there are indirect measures that would facilitate the repopulation of those territories with other ethnic groups. So we can treat this type of crimes in view of the policies of the Russian Federation that pursues some criminal purposes of violating our territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Encouraging us and indeed the investigators and prosecutors to look at the broader policy and intentions behind the crimes. Dear colleagues, I'm very grateful that all of our three speakers today are united by, if I could say the word sustainability, but they're sustainable and so long-lasting work in and on Ukraine. And I'm just hoping that we will see even more of this sustainability and, as Wayne said, coordination and harmonization of such good efforts to bring justice to the survivors and to the survivors who turned out to be such not only since February this year, but indeed to those who have suffered from Russia's aggression since 2014. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much to our audience. Have a good afternoon and see you soon.